Previous week, when we had our All Things New ACC Parish Hall meeting with Brenda Kresge from the diocese, we had a number of questions that were submitted, a number of questions that we tried to answer to the best of our ability. That audio recording of that is on our ACC website if you would like to listen to that if you weren't able to attend. But there were a number of, I think, very good questions. And one of the questions that came up a number of different times in some different ways was on vocations, especially the fact that we do have a shortage of priests, or we have a lack of priests in the diocese and in the United States in general. And one of the comments said something along the lines of that bishops and priests have not done enough to promote vocations to the priesthood in recent years. And again, I thought that was a rather interesting question or comment, and perhaps deserves a little bit more of attention, because there's truth to that. There is some truth to that. And as we look at some of the reasons why that might be, and again, some of the ones that we tried to address at the meeting, but I think there is a sense that in at least these last few decades, that the church has very much tried to emphasize the role of the layperson. And with good reason. I think it is good to emphasize the role of the lay people, but in doing so and promoting that lay leadership and how there is meant to be that real involvement of the people, that the people in pews, the parishioners, can't just leave everything to priest or even to staff, that we all must be involved in the faith and the operation of a parish, of a church, that does need to be promoted. But I think there's that possibility when we're doing that, we can diminish or sometimes discount the role of the priesthood and that distinction of the priest himself. And again, it's not necessarily bad or wrong, it's just part of that consequence and part of that reality that we face. And yes, there maybe hasn't been as much emphasis on priesthood or that vocation to priesthood or religious life in general in the last few decades in this country in particular. But today, as we hear in the gospel about the call of those first disciples of Jesus, those men who would become his apostles, who would become those first priests of the new covenant, it is good for us to reflect upon vocations and to promote them. And if you know me, you know I'm not necessarily one to shy away from a little bit of a challenge or sometimes even controversy, because that is part of the struggle. I think a lot of priests are uncomfortable with promoting priesthood because the emphasis has been on lay leadership for so long that any aspect of the priest promoting or talking about priesthood and its importance and its distinction from the laity is at times going to sound to many people kind of elitist. Maybe there's some of that clericalism. Maybe make people uncomfortable. And probably making many priests uncomfortable too. It's kind of hard to say those things, knowing that it might upset some people, and knowing that it is really a complicated issue, and one that needs a lot of distinction. And it's not easy to cover all those grounds, or it's easy to misspeak and say something wrong or say something that is, like I said, going to upset somebody in the congregation. So I think many priests avoid it. But it is worth talking about, and it is worth expressing what the church teaches and has always taught about the priesthood and celibate life in general. Because it does say that celibate state of life, that celibate vocation, is objectively superior to marriage. The celibate state of life is objectively superior to marriage. And right off the bat, I imagine that might make some of you a little uncomfortable to hear that. We like to think everybody's the same or everything is equal. And if we hear that, we might get a different impression. But it does require, obviously, qualifications. Because yes, it is objectively, as an object, as a state of life, superior. Because it does more closely resemble that life of Christ. It does more directly point to the purpose of the church in sanctity, in pointing to that eternal life, in focusing on those higher things, the spiritual things. Because as St. Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians, those who are married will be focusing on the things of this world. The husband concerned for his wife, the wife concerned for her husband, necessarily having that focus here, which is important and is good. And yet we also know that in heaven, relationships change, that are transcended. That Jesus says in heaven, there is no more marriage or giving in marriage, but is there living for the Lord. And that celibate state, that consecrated life, where one gives their life to God and is received by the church. I'm not talking about just somebody who is single their whole life, but that true consecrated celibacy, whose vows have been received by the church, is that symbol of what is to come and is meant to be that light for the world to see. It is, in that sense, higher than what marriage is. But that does not mean that those who are in that celibate state are necessarily more holy, or even have the opportunity to necessarily be more holy than somebody who is married or is single. Because the subjective superiority is not the case. Objectively, celibate state is superior as an object, but that subject, as it applies to each individual, is not the case. And the Lord himself speaks in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 19, where he talks about marriage and celibacy, that celibacy is a gift, not given to all, but to those who receive it as a gift, is meant to be given in return, one's life. And that is a good thing. But if it is not a gift that you have received, then it would be wrong to pursue it. Just as if you have not received that gift of marriage. It's wrong to try to give your life to somebody else who is married or something like that. There is that holiness of the subject, the individual, which is depending on their call. And the church has taught and continues to teach that those who are in that state of married life can be just as holy, and many times are more holy than somebody in the celibate state. Because it is how they live out that grace, that gift. It is how they live in charity for one another that is their path to holiness. And that is important to remember. But it is also important to recognize how these two vocations work together. And St. John Paul II wrote about how in the life of the church, when marriage and family is under attack, and when marriage and holy marriage becomes more challenging or degraded, or family life becomes more difficult, or becomes more difficult to have children or to raise children for whatever reason, and marriage suffers, vocations to the priesthood and to the celibate state will also suffer. Because those vocations come from families, they come from marriages. And they are far more likely to come from those healthy and holy marriages. And so marriages are meant to support vocations, and that vocation to the celibate life is meant to then promote holiness in marriage. And it is meant to go back and forth, lifting up and supporting and encouraging each other. So yes, priests and bishops need to promote vocations to the priesthood. But in many ways, families are even more important in doing so. And as we go forth, it is good to acknowledge how good vocations are. It is good to acknowledge the gift that we have in vocation. And as in marriage, the husband gives himself to his wife, the wife gives herself to her husband. There's that mutual self-giving. So in that celibate life, in those declarations of vows, the priest or the religious gives their life to God. And God gives himself in a particular way to enable that vocation to help promote that life of the church. It is a beautiful thing, and we should encourage it. We should promote it. We should respect it. And any of those things which would take away that dignity of the priesthood, we should avoid. Or to say that that celibate state is somehow harmful to vocations or priesthood, I think is doing a real disservice to that state of vocations in general, for marriage, for priests, for religious. And we must recognize that what God has given, we should rejoice in. And we should promote it and strengthen it in whatever ways we can, so that together, all vocations, all individuals, married or celibate, might work for greater holiness in the church and in individual lives, and that we might all come to that grace of eternal life with God in heaven, to rejoice there forever with all those holy men and women, the saints of God.